Going into the year 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. Maintaining the balance between free states and slave states kept the nation from arguing about slavery in federal politics. The slave controversy grew in 1819 when Missouri applied to become a state. This would upset the slave state-free state balance since Missouri had slaves. The slave states feared that if there were more free states than slave states, that the free states would abolish slavery. The slavery argument became a states' rights versus federal power over slavery argument when New York Representative James Talmadge proposed that no slavery would expand into new territories. Kentucky Representative Henry Clay proposed a compromise which became known as the Missouri Compromise, an attempt to solve the slavery argument. According to this compromise, Missouri would be added as a slave state. In order to balance the number of slave states and free states, territory from Massachusetts would be taken to be made into a free state. This new free state would be Maine. In addition, a line would be drawn at 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude across the Louisiana Purchase. Any territories north of the line would be free, and any territories south of the line would be slave. Henry Clay believed that this compromise would solve the slavery debate and keep slavery out of federal politics. However, not everybody was as optimistic as Clay. Thomas Jefferson, who was in his later years, felt that the Missouri Compromise would be what he called the knell of the Union. Knell, K-N-E-L-L, is a solemn bell ringing at a funeral. Jefferson felt that the line would lead to more arguments over slavery and lead to destruction of the Union. Supporters were happy, though, to get slavery out of federal politics. Through the mid-1830s, the House of Representatives barred discussion of anti-slavery petitions. This was known as the gag rule. Slavery was avoided in federal politics as a major issue for the next several years, but it would only be a matter of time. Annexation of Texas into the United States was a major topic in the early 1840s. Slavery was not one of the major issues at this time. However, in 1844, the Liberty Party, an anti-slavery party, took votes away from Henry Clay, and in turn James Polk would win the presidency in 1844. Polk was a supporter of slavery and believed in states' rights, but didn't take an active position. He was more interested in expanding the nation. He favored the annexation of Texas and linked it with the Oregon Country so not to upset the free state-slave state balance. President James K. Polk had four major goals: reduce tariffs on imports, reestablish an independent treasury, settle disputes with Britain over control of Oregon, and acquire California and New Mexico for the United States. He is one of the few presidents who was able to achieve all of his goals. Polk presided over America during the period known as Manifest Destiny, in which Americans believed it was their right to expand westward to the Pacific. Polk having won the presidency shows that the public supported annexation of Texas, which took place at the end of John Tyler's presidency. As a result, Mexico broke off relations with the U.S. Polk wanted to purchase land from Mexico, and in proposed legislation to make Mexico an offer, a representative named David Wilmot put an amendment on the bill saying that slavery would not exist in any territory bought from Mexico. This Wilmot proviso reintroduced slavery into federal politics and increased sectional politics over the slavery issue. There were disputes over which river was the boundary between Texas and Mexico. James Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to Texas with cannons aimed across the Rio Grande. He wanted war with Mexico, but he needed them to start it. The U.S. would defeat Mexico in the Mexican War, and in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, negotiated by Nicholas Trist, the United States would get the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession included California, the Utah Territory, and the New Mexico Territory. Results of the war would eventually lead to slavery being a major issue, since arguments over whether or not slavery should spread would rise as America got more territory. Sectional politics over slavery between the North and South were growing in the United States. The slavery issue with territorial expansion westward would only intensify. John Sutter, owned a sawmill in California. In January of 1848, gold would be found at Sutter's mill. James Marshall, one of Sutter's workers, was the one that found the gold in the river at Sutter's mill. Sutter and Marshall conducted tests on what they found in the river and determined that it really was gold. Sutter wanted Marshall to keep the gold finding a secret because he was afraid of losing his workers before all of his wheat could be harvested. Word of the gold strike would eventually reach the East Coast. Many Americans, once they found out that it was true, the gold really was found in California, went west in order to find gold and get rich. Some 49ers found gold, others got wealthy by other means. Nevertheless, California grew in population, and cities such as San Francisco became gold mining towns. Everybody was hoping to strike it rich by finding gold.
I'm struck it rich! I'm a billionaire! I'm a trillionaire! I'm a zillionaire!
Gold was actually found by Mexicans in the 1830s in a couple different spots, Southern California, but not the gold fields that we associate with the gold rush. The Mexicans had no idea, of course, that gold of the amount discovered in the 1850s and 1860s actually existed there. But before California becomes a state, gold is discovered. And it's one of those transforming episodes in the American past. And the rush is on.
The gold rush is maybe the classic American story. One of the funny things about the gold rush is that very few people actually made any money from gold itself.
In Gold Rush, California, success followed a willingness to try and fail, and try and fail, and try and fail. In New England, where American culture originated, there wasn't a tolerance of failure like this. Failure was equated with sin and with moral failing. In California, the gold rush, none of that applied. Everybody understood that luck was as much a factor in success as anything else.
The lure of quick money has just had an enormous attraction for the new America at that time.
The scramble for mineral wealth, which is extremely ugly. It involves the rape of the countryside, the exploitation of Mexicans, the extermination of local tribes, the mistreatment of Asians who come in as laborers and are also very badly treated in the mines, the terrible loss of life and impoverishment of the people who go out and dig the stuff.
This was a signal event that transformed the landscape. It transformed the demography of California in the West, and one could argue was a seismic shift in American history of the mid-19th century.
Ironically, the great breakthrough of the gold rush was not creating fortunes from this precious metal found in the hills of California. It was, in a sense, the invention of California itself. I mean, it made this extraordinary city, San Francisco, and got enough people to move all the way out there that the state was able to really kind of turn into the extraordinary creature that it is today.
By mid-June 1848, 3/4 of the men in San Francisco left the town to find gold, leaving stores empty, schools closed, and ships docked because their workers had deserted them. By late summer 1848, newspapers back east began to reprint stories from California papers about the discovery of gold. They printed letters from miners telling of their successes. Many Easterners doubted these claims until President Polk confirmed the stories in December of that year. Soon, fortune seekers arrived in California from all over the United States and the world, including Europe. Ships traveling from California to Hawaii, Mexico, South America, and China all brought back gold hunters as well as supplies to sell. Most of these men expected to return home as soon as they struck it rich. For many years, there were very few women who made the trip to California.
This began to change, and they tried to bring more women settlers out to California. California, for example, was the first American state to pass a law that would allow married women to retain the property they owned before they were married. And this was a big deal because that brought women out to California realizing that once they got married, they would still retain their property rights.
Gold seekers had a choice of traveling to California by land or sea. Both were treacherous. Travelers might choose to sail to Panama and take a separate ship north to California. They risked disease and other hardships on the long journey. Many chose to travel overland on the California Trail. Those who timed their trips poorly risked freezing to death in the Sierra Nevada mountains if they got to them after September. Despite the dangers facing anyone attempting to make the journey, the mass migration to California continued throughout 1849. Those who embarked on the mass migration were called 49ers. They were said to have caught gold fever because they succumbed to the desire for instant wealth that made farming and most other occupations seem unappealing by comparison.
What the settlers thought, the people who moved out west, the emigrants out west, believed from the stories was that, you went there a poor man, and overnight you were fabulously wealthy. There were large amounts of gold, and you could settle there and, become rich beyond all your expectations overnight. What they discovered for the most part was it was very tiny amounts of gold, but they called gold dust.
One gold seeker called this gold fever the beginning of our national madness, our insanity of greed. The miners were not the only ones who were motivated by greed. So too were the merchants. As some 80,000 people swarmed into California in 1849 looking for gold, prices for everything soared. It has been said that a pair of boots which cost $2.50 in the East sold for $20 in California. Gambling halls, saloons, and other entertainment sites appeared virtually overnight, and many men spent all of their gold dust there.
Many people went away broke. The people that did make money, though, were the business people. The people that could sell watermelons or tomatoes or potatoes or squash, lettuce, people who were raising beef. Those were in great demand because these miners that were showing up in 49 and 50 literally had nothing but was on their back.
Wherever gold was found, boomtown settlements sprang up. The men set up tents and wooden shanties as their only protection against the weather. Many of these instant towns disappeared as soon as the gold was mined out. The gold miners spent long, hard hours digging and sifting as ice-cold torrents of water came down from the mountains and the sun beat down. Their boots and clothes rotted away, their hands blistered. Heavy rains would wash away the dams they built, forcing them to start all over again. Many of the gold seekers who left their homes in 1849 did not make it to the digging sites until 1850, by which time much of the surface gold had been removed. It took teams of men to wring any new gold from the earth. The miners built contraptions called long toms that were between 8 and 15 feet long. With a steady stream of water channeled into them, the long toms would sift dirt much more efficiently, but for many, this still yielded little or no gold.
After the U.S. admitted California to the Union in 1850, the nation had a total of 32 states and reached across North America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The U.S. population had grown from 2.5 million in the colonial days of 1760 to 25 million people in 1850, 10 times as many people in just 90 years. With the country's population now spread out across thousands of miles, communication became a challenge. In 1857, the Federal Postal Service launched a twice-weekly stagecoach service that guaranteed delivery of mail from St. Louis to San Francisco in 29 days. But the freighting and stagecoach firm Russell, Majors and Waddell thought they could do it even faster. In 1860, they created the Pony Express. They chose expert riders to ride fast horses in a cross-country relay. Pony Express mail delivery from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California took only 10 days. As the pioneers had expanded west, the North had developed an industrial economy, while the South had relied on agriculture. As a result, by 1850, the North had become much richer than the South, creating 2/3 of the products made in the United States. The power of the states was now increasing, and the power of the federal government was decreasing. Each state government set its own policies, which often differed greatly from the laws in other states. Generally, the northern states were opposed to slavery, and the southern states were pro-slavery. Southerners believed that slaves were vital to the success of their farms and cotton plantations, that their economy would collapse without slavery. Northerners who wanted to abolish slavery were called abolitionists. But some territories, like Kansas, were settled by both Southerners who favored slavery and Northerners who opposed it.
Tensions were rising between the North and the South. Each wanted to settle the West in its own distinct image.
The North is far more populous, far more economically developed than the South, but it has not exercised real political power in the nation. The South has had a stranglehold on the Democratic Party, on the presidency, on the Supreme Court.
The nation was at a crossroads. The power struggle between North and South was escalating into a crisis that demanded an extraordinary president. As it turned out, Zachary Taylor was not that man. Number 12, Zachary Taylor, Whig, 1849 to 1850, 64 years old, from Louisiana. Zachary Taylor was a celebrity, a Mexican war hero who'd helped to win over 500,000 square miles of new land for the nation. He was also a political unknown.
Zachary Taylor was someone who was not seeking the presidency. Both parties came to him and wanted him to be their candidate.
As a war hero, he appealed to the North. As a Louisiana landowner and slaveholder, he appealed to the South. He had no obvious agenda, but in the end, he would surprise them all.
There's something about Zachary Taylor. If I had to pick out a prototypical pre-Civil War American, I certainly would pick Old Rough and Ready.
Taylor's nom de guerre, Old Rough and Ready, was as much a tribute to his fighting spirit as it was for his slovenly appearance. He had none of the polish of a professional politician and was not a great communicator. Taylor had never registered to vote and didn't even vote in his own election. Despite outward appearances, he was really a Washington insider. His army position had been arranged by his second cousin, James Madison. Robert E. Lee was his fourth cousin once removed, and Jefferson Davis had been his son-in-law. As president, Taylor deferred to others, going so far as to declare he would not exercise his veto power.
Taylor didn't really see the presidency as a very powerful office, and he was actually strongly influenced by members of his cabinet and by certain members of Congress.
He did say that he believed that the slavery issue should be decided by Congress, and Congress would be the ruling body, and that he would go along with whatever Congress proposed.
The slavery debate was beginning to get ugly. The fragile peace between North and South, established 30 years earlier by the Missouri Compromise, was starting to crumble.
Well, when Zachary Taylor came into office, the country was facing a serious crisis over the question of the expansion of slavery into new Western territory.
On one side, Southern extremists were threatening secession if Congress didn't rule in their favor. On the other side, the clamor of Northern abolitionists was growing louder. In response, Senator Henry Clay created the Compromise of 1850, a bundle of bills designed to link the admission of California as a free state with some slavery measures favorable to the South.
Through the mid-1840s, James Polk had doubled the size of the U.S. after Texas was annexed, and then having gotten the Mexican Cession, winning the war with Mexico, and bought Oregon from Britain, expanding the U.S. to the Pacific. The question was whether or not new states would be added with or without slaves. The South always tried to maintain an equal number of slaves in free states. California was growing from the gold rush and making demands to become a free state, but arguments over slavery that stemmed from the Wilmot Proviso would threaten the nation. Many Northern Whigs were starting to oppose slavery, as William Seward said there was a higher law against slavery. The Compromise of 1850 would be an attempt to resolve all of these issues. Henry Clay from Kentucky would develop the Compromise, and it had 6 parts. California would be admitted as a free state. This was the major positive for the North. The rest of the Mexican Cession would be subjected to popular sovereignty, or allowing the people in that territory to decide. Texas would give up some of its territory, which would also be subjected to popular sovereignty. In addition, Texas would be given money from the federal government to pay off its debts from when it was an independent country. The Fugitive Slave Act was also part. This act said that runaway slaves had to be returned. This was the major positive for the South. Finally, the slave trade in D.C. would be abolished. Clay hoped that all 6 parts would pass in one big bill. When that failed, and with his health going down, he turned to Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois who had ambitions to one day be president, to work in order to get each part of the compromise passed separately. The individual bills Stephen Douglas was working on would have to be signed by President Taylor to become law.
So this was a kind of package that Clay put before the Congress, giving some concessions to the slave states and some concessions to the free states, which he hoped would go through and satisfy everybody.
But the compromise didn't satisfy some people, including President Taylor.
Taylor surprised a lot of people. He thought there was something to compromise about. He said, look, California should be admitted as a free state, and that's it.
Taking back his promise, Taylor threatened to veto the compromise.
Taylor insisted on going ahead, even at the risk of provoking Southern state secession.
Taylor's solution for the secessionists was somewhat simplistic.
I'll hang him. And I might start with my son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, who was a senator from Mississippi at that time.
I think his best moment was simply affirming the integrity of the nation in response to threats of disunion that were coming from the South as the controversy over the Compromise of 1850 intensified.
Barely a year into his administration, Taylor was evolving into an ardent Unionist. On a hot 4th of July in 1850, Taylor took a break from the political infighting to preside over a groundbreaking ceremony for the Washington Monument. Scorched by the summer sun, Taylor sought relief with a pitcher of milk and a bowl of cherries. Within hours, he complained of severe stomach pains.
There are people who were proposing that he was actually poisoned by arsenic, that there was this conspiracy to get rid of him.
Taylor died 5 days later. Most believed he succumbed to gastroenteritis, an inflammation of the intestines. But there were lingering suspicions of foul play. It would take more than a century before anyone would know for certain. In 1991, an historian convinced Taylor's descendants to allow his body to be exhumed. Forensic analysis revealed no signs of foul play. Instead, they determined that a form of cholera was the most likely cause of Taylor's death.
As far as I'm concerned, he definitively was not poisoned with arson.
Where Taylor might have taken the country is a mystery, but it would soon move in an entirely different direction when Taylor's vice president assumed the presidency. Number 13, Millard Fillmore, Whig, 1850 to 1853, 50 years old, from New York. Unlucky number 13, Millard Fillmore was an accidental president. Millard Fillmore hadn't even met Zachary Taylor until after they were elected. Seen as Taylor's opposite, Fillmore was picked merely to balance the ticket geographically and politically. Fillmore was a Northerner, an affable man who was always dressed impeccably. He was a bookworm and a hands-off manager. He aimed to please and appease rather than lead.
He was a kind of colorless character who believed in compromise, who deferred to congressional leadership.
Fillmore continued to exert his newfound power by reversing the policy of his predecessor and signing the Compromise of 1850 into law.
Fillmore said, no, I'm in now and I'm going to change the government's policy. Taylor was all wrong about the Compromise of 1850.
Fillmore supported slavery because he believed its abolition would lead to a collapse of the Southern economy.
60% of U.S. exports came out of the cotton states by 1860. So to abolish slavery was to abolish an economic system.
Fillmore also believed that slavery was protected by the Constitution, and that by signing the Compromise, he would somehow put the issue to rest forever. What he failed to grasp were the moral consequences, and he blamed abolitionists for making slavery an issue.
He was totally opposed to the abolitionists. He thought they were troublemakers, fanatics.
Fillmore was content with the Compromise because he thought it would preserve the status quo. For some, however, it only served to strengthen their resolve against slavery. By supporting the Compromise, Fillmore hoped to please everyone, but instead he ended up pleasing no one, including members of his own party. In the election of 1852, the Whigs wouldn't renominate him. So Fillmore went home to Buffalo, leaving behind one of the most forgettable presidencies in American history.
The Fugitive Slave Act would prove to be the most controversial part. It caused more division between the North and the South. Also, it was a federal responsibility since it was a federal crime to obstruct capturing a runaway slave or sheltering a runaway slave. Before this, slavery was more of a matter of principle and politics, not wanting to be dominated by the Southern plantation owners who had the power. Now, slavery was on the table as an issue. A riot even erupted in Boston over the federal government trying to enforce this law, when a slave that ran away was in Boston and the feds were closing in. A feeling was growing in the North that the Fugitive Slave Act was forcing them to be complicit with slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act led to an increase in abolitionists. It also led to an increase in the Underground Railroad, as abolitionists were working to help the slaves escape slavery in the South. In addition, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her book showed that blacks had families and emotions just like whites, and it increased the number of abolitionists.